Okay, here's one of the ones I gave you to do that I want to go over. And what made this one a little bit trickier or a little bit easier, depending on your perspective, is that my coefficient here in front of the t was not a 2 or a 4 or a 1/2 or something like that, but it's got this thing in it, pi over 3. Well, actually, you're going to see in the end, you probably saw if you actually did this one, that it makes it easier to graph. So I've got one with all the parameters here. We get to try everything on this problem. And so let me start out with this. My middle value is D, which in this case is 4. My maximum and minimum. D plus or minus A. And you can think of these as 4 plus 3 or 4 minus 3 or 4 plus negative 3 or 4 minus negative 3. Have at it. Whether you go 4 plus or minus 3 or 4 plus or minus negative 3, either way, you're going to get 1 and, let me show it all. 4 plus or minus 3, 1 and 7 are going to be your minimum and maximum values. Okay. B was a little bit different for you. Period, always 2 pi over b. So I'm writing down the formulas here that I want you to plug into. This is 2 pi over 3. And this is the point where a lot of you freak out on the math. But I hope you won't. Actually, I hope you didn't. Let's think about this. This is 2 pi divided by pi over 3. Well, I could write this as 2 pi divided by pi over 3. That might be a more familiar way for me to have written it for you. Now remember, when you divide by a fraction, you turn that second fraction upside down, and then you multiply. So the period is going to be 6. Okay. I always want a quarter period. That's 1/4 times 6. Or 6/4, or 3/2. So A and D, again, affect, where's my middle value is D. A, my amplitude, how far above and below 4 do I go? 3 units, the absolute value of that. Above and below 4, 1 and 7. Those are my middle and Y values. I've got the period, I've got the quarter period. I just need to know where to start this thing. I'm going to start when BT plus C equals 0. In this case, that's pi over 3t minus pi over 6 is 0. I'm going to add pi over 6 to both sides. I don't like that coefficient in front of the t, so I am going to get rid of it by multiplying by its reciprocal. I'm going to multiply the left side by 3 over pi. I'm allowed to do that as long as I also multiply the right side by 3 over pi. And I get t equals 1/2. So when I set up my graph, I've got to make sure I have 1/2 in it. And then every 3/2 is going to be a quarter period. So setting up my table, let's do that first. Again, I want to make sure I have my start point on here. So I'm going to start at 1/2, and then I'm going to go up every 3/2. So 4/2, also known as 2. 7/2. 10/2, also known as 5. 13/2, and 16/2, also known as 8. Going backwards, it'll be -2/2, also known as -1, and -5/2. Okay. Step by step here then. Multiply all of these by pi over 3. -5 pi over 6. I'm going to keep these. I'm actually going to use these with all the 6's on the bottom because I know I'm going to be subtracting pi over 6 in a second. So -2 pi over 6, pi over 6, 4 pi over 6, 7 pi over 6, 10 pi over 6, 13 pi over 6, and 16 pi over 6. You got to multiply these all by pi over 3. So I multiply the numerators of these fractions by pi, multiply the denominators by 3, which turned them into 6. And there we go. Why did I want to do that? Because I wanted pi over 3t minus pi over 6. So pi over 6 minus pi over 6 is 0. Really happy to see this because I rigged this so that would be 0. Okay, so take away a pi over 6, I get 3 pi over 6, 6 pi over 6, 9 pi over 6, 12 pi over 6, and 15 pi over 6. Take away a pi over 6, -3 pi over 6, and -6 pi over 6. If you can get away without this column, or without putting the fractions in this column, with the 6's in it, I'm just fine with that. Let's get these reduced to -pi, -pi over 2, 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi, and 5 pi over 2. And I am ecstatic when I see this because I chose those values of t, so I would get these nice pretty values of 0, pi over 2, pi, all the multiples of pi over 2 here. Cameraman, can I go a little bit to the right here? Okay. So now what do I want next? Cosine of this mess. Cosine of pi over 3t minus 6. So cosine of 0 now, remember, is 1. My x-coordinate, my horizontal coordinate, cosine of 0 is 1. Then it goes to 0. Then my horizontal coordinate is -1. Here my horizontal coordinate is 0. Here it's back to 1. And there it's back to 0. Going backwards this way, my horizontal coordinate is 0. Here it is -1. And finally, -3 cosine of this guy. I wrote 6 here. It should have been pi over 6. Plus 4. So take this guy, multiply it by -3 and add 4. +3 plus 4 is 7. Multiply this by -3, it's still 0. Add 4, I get 4. Multiply this by -3, I get -3. Add 4, I get 1. Here I get 4. -1 times -3 times -1 is +3 plus 4 is 7. And I got a pattern here. 7, 4, 1, 4. 7, that's going to give me a 4. That's going to give me a 1. And that's going to give me a 4. All right. Now when I go to graph this, way over here, my input values, -5/2, -1, 1/2, 2. I want tick marks at least every 1/2. And I only need to go as far as 8 to get as much as I graphed there. So, and my y values never went negative. I'm between 1 and 4, so, or between 1 and 7. So as I sketch my axes, don't need to go put my axis here. I can go way down here because I don't have any negative values. Here's 2, 4, 6, and 8. I've got my 1, 7, and 4 covered on here. And I've got, I want to go every 1/2 here. So I'm going to go 1, 2, 3. I want to go out to 8. Let's try this again. No, it's good. 2, 4, 6, and 8. Can I put other little marks in here to get my 1/2s? Okay, my reader sees that 4 hash marks between 0 and 2. So each hash mark, here's 2, here's 1, here's a half. Each hash mark is 1/2. My envelope that my graph is trapped in is between 1 and 7. Middle value is 4. So I'm going to be between 1. Middle values at 4. Maximums at 7. And here we go. I'm going to start with the 1/2 comma 1. 1/2 comma 1 is right here. And then what have I got next? I've got 2 comma 4. 2, 4. Note every 3 tick marks, every 3 halves, I erased that the quarter period was 3 halves, but every 1, 2, 3 halves is where I'm going to hit a key point. 7 halves, 7. Up here. 1, 2, 3 halves later, I'm at 5 and 4. 1, 2, 3 halves later, I'm at 6.5 or 13 halves and 1. 1, 2, 3 halves later, I'm at 8 and 4. It's actually here if I drew that line straight. And I went what? Low, middle, high, middle, low, middle. Going backwards, I'm at middle, high, middle, low. I'm going to guess that here at -1, 1, 2, 3 tick marks back, I'm in the middle. And then 1, 2, 3 tick marks behind that, I'm going to be high at -5 halves 7. -5 halves 7. I match my table, and we can draw our pretty curve and send our cameramen home.